Okay. We should be live. All right. So it should be a good stream tonight. I'm looking forward to it. We will have a stream next week, but it will probably be a little shorter because I am going on vacation. But I will be back that evening if I don't have any plane delays. So if there is no stream next week, it is because my plane got delayed. So please comment any comments you have throughout the stream in the live chat. Please hit the like button now if you haven't already, or hit it if you see this later on after it has already aired live. It really helps fuel the algorithm and it helps support this content. We are going to discuss a talk that was hold on. Hopefully we did not lose the live stream. Let's see here. Sorry if we did. Okay, hopefully we did not lose that live stream. But we are going to discuss a talk between Sabine Hossenfelder and Luke Barnes on the fine-tuning argument of the universe and theism and science and what is a scientific question versus what is not a scientific question. And this is something that I really think we need to get into a lot across many channels, not just this one, because we don't have an answer for this as a community. I don't know which community I'm referring to, but any community, there is no real answer to this yet. Even my own community, I would say, which if you would like to join our Discord community, send me a private message on Instagram or Twitter, and I will send you the link. We have live phone calls every Thursday that are totally open and informal, and you are welcome to join. With that, this is the chat that we are going to discuss. By the way, please comment in the chat how the internet is, how the sound is, because we have been having some internet issues today. So this is the talk that we are going to discuss. Was the Cosmos Made for Us? With Sabine Hossenfelder and Luke Barnes. And it is a talk that is about the fine-tuning argument, for the most part, and whether or not it is a valid scientific argument for a specific theory, which that theory would be theism, essentially. And even though I am, a total theist, like a very confident theist, I don't want to say total theist, a completely confident theist, I will say that, completely confident theist, due to logic and personal experience and just philosophical reasoning, and hopefully, I think, eventually scientific evidence, I would say, not proof, but evidence. I don't think we can prove it. I don't think you can prove God's existence to someone else. You can provide evidence for God's existence. I think that there's evidence all around us. That's part of the problem, is everything, not everything, but so many, maybe everything around us is evidence for God's existence, and therefore we don't even see it. It's like the forest through the trees issue. But there is no such thing as proof of God, other than personal first-hand experience to you. But that my personal first-hand experience with God does not prove God's existence to Sabine Hossenfelder, even though it does prove it to me. There are, I would say, logical arguments, logical proofs, maybe you could say, for the existence of God, which I'm defining as an initial sentience, singular sentience, sentient being that is responsible for the creation of all other sentient beings, and for what we call the universe, and is also the singular sentient being that is the totality of the assembly of all other sentient beings, of the multiplicity of sentient beings that has been created. So that is the definition of God that I am going to be using in this talk and pretty much throughout this channel if you're not familiar with it, unless we are going to specifically get into scripture on certain streams, which we will do, but not this one too much. But this was a good talk. I actually think it opened up avenues for me for exploration of kind of narratives in science going forward in the future that are more interesting than even this specific discussion, but it does kind of give you a baseline of what are the two narratives that I would say are the common narratives in the scientific discussion, which is, one is a theistic argument of kind of fine-tuning. It's the fine-tuning argument. And the other one is an anti-theistic argument, which is that consciousness comes from unconsciousness and is an emergent phenomenon instead of a fundamental phenomenon, I guess you could say. But as much as I am a confident theist, I don't actually think that the fine-tuning argument is a good argument, and we're going to talk about that tonight. And I admire that people use it. I think that it makes sense within the logical framework that is the current scientific narrative. But I think that current scientific narrative that it exists within and it is a product of is incorrect, fundamentally incorrect. So this is, like I said, the stream we're going to talk about. It is on the Premier Unbelievable ? YouTube channel, which seems to have a bunch of different, topics, hot topics, mental health, moral discussions. I mean, this is, I would definitely, I've been a subscriber to them for a while, but I have not actually looked too much into their content. But this looks like a lot of stuff that I love to think about. So probably will do more streams on them in the future. But here is the intros to the people who we will be discussing. And by the way, if this is said below and it's said at the end, but I should probably start saying it at the beginning, I have utmost respect for anybody who is willing to go out and put their ideas out there and discuss these difficult topics in a honest and kind fashion. So.
Voices together from around the world. And
joining me today are Luke Barnes and Sabine Hossenfelder. Luke Barnes is an astrophysicist researching galaxy formation and dark energy at Western Sydney University. He's a co-author of books including A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos, and believes that fine-tuning provides evidence that life was indeed intended by a creator. Sabine Hossenfelder is a theoretical physicist researching dark matter at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies, and she's the author of Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. She doesn't believe the universe is fine-tuned for life, or that God's existence can be hypothesized from science. Such a treat to have you both on the programme with me today, Sabine and Luke. Thank you for joining me. Let's start with you, Sabine. How did you get involved in this particular area of science? And tell us a little bit about your interest, because you don't only produce great videos on your YouTube channel explaining scientific concepts, you even do music videos and things. So tell us a little about yourself, first of all.
Yeah. Okay, actually, I think we're going to leave it at that for now, because I want to talk about something kind of an overarching theme that is important to this stream, which is what is science and what is logic? Because I think that we have so conflated what science is within the discussion, I don't want to say academic, but you could say academic discussion from preschool to post graduate PhD level education. And it has now become a word that is a substitute for the term truth, which is something that it was never meant to be. Science is a method of trying to learn what is true in a specific set of circumstances through the process of experimentation, and the scientific method specifically being applied to the setup of that experimentation. So that is something that is the kind of, I think everybody would agree that science is at least that. Maybe it's more than that, but it's at least that. And the scientific method is something that's very genius and critical. And when I first started working on sentient singularity theory, it wasn't called sentient singularity theory. I was just trying to figure out how do you make general intelligence, quote unquote. And what I realized is that thinking is a very specific code. There is a method of thinking that is the method of thinking, and it is the only method of thinking that there is. There is feeling, which is kind of perception in context, in the context of you. That's what feeling is. It's perceiving, something that is contextualized around you, and so it causes a feeling. And use of any of your senses would constitute a feeling. So seeing something with your eyes is actually feeling. Touching something with your hands is feeling. Hearing something with your ears is feeling. All of this is feeling. And if you don't believe that seeing something with your eyes is feeling, if that would hurt. When somebody shines a bright light in your face, it hurts your eyes. It hurts your eyes because it is feeling. You're feeling even when you smell, when you taste. That's why eating something very, very spicy can hurt your mouth. It's a painful thing. So we don't normally think of these things as feeling, but they are feeling. And but thinking is different than feeling. Feeling is more fundamental than thinking, but thinking is the process of organizing multiple bits of information that have been gathered already. So you perceive by feeling, and then at least you perceive first person by feeling, and then you organize that information by thinking. And humans have this ability, this almost unique ability that we see insofar as we can see in the biological world that we know of, at least around us, or that we have categorized and documented in human civilization, that we have this ability to abstractly reason about things, and that allows you to think in a situation that you have constructed in your mind that isn't right in front of you in the physical world. So you can think through scenarios without actually going through scenarios. And that's something that, at least to the degree that we can do it, is, I think, uniquely human in the animal world. But it's not that other animals can't do this, or other sentient beings can't do this, but humans do have an ability to do it to a degree, at least. We'll talk more about the specifics of that in a future stream. That is more so than even like a dog or a primate, another primate. But so this is important because this stream deals in what is a scientific question. What is appropriate for science, for us to use science in order to answer. And I think almost any question is just instinctually, I haven't thought enough about it in that context to give it to you a for sure answer, but instinctually right now I want to say that you can use it to try and answer almost any question. That doesn't mean it can, but it can be applicable to almost any question. But you need to get the right formulation of that question. So when we say things like, what is the meaning of life? There's two. You can go through a scientific process of experimentation, I think. We'll talk more about that later this year. That would show you evidence of a specific nature to the universe that would imply certain things about, the answer to that question that we are trying to answer by asking that question, because I don't think that's actually a good question. What is the meaning of life? But there is something that we are trying to get at an answer in that question, and I think that scientific experimentation can even give us information that would be relevant to that. I don't want to say that question, but the question that we're trying to ask by asking that question, which is probably what is the meaning of creation, or of of multiplicity of sentience, essentially. But that's not as intuitive as what is the meaning of life. But this, so here we go. Let's look up science here. Science. The simple definition of science is: science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. And scientific methodology includes the following: objective observation, measurement and data, possibly, although not necessarily, using mathematics as a tool, and experimentation, essentially. So there's this is where the issue comes into play, is that whole statement of objective observation. I used that statement on my website, sentientsingularity.com, but I've since changed it here to: what is the definition of a fundamental theory? A recognizable, describable, predictable, and applicable pattern that occurs in all instances of... I changed it from objective observation to supersubjective observation and an explanation for such a pattern. Because I don't really know whether or not there's such a thing as an objective observation. I don't really think that there is. I think that the term observation implies an observer, which implies that it is subjective to the observer. Okay? That doesn't mean that there aren't things that are true to multiple observers at once, or even to all observers at once. And you could call that an objective observation, but the problem is that that's not really an objective observation. It's a supersubjective observation. It's true within the subjective observation of everyone. And, maybe we could call that an objective observation, but I don't think that that is a term that is helping us. So I changed it, even though I understood what was trying to be, asked with that. So when you say this, that science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding, using a systematic methodology based on evidence, scientific methodology includes the following: objective observation. That is not the exact same thing as experimentation. And it's part of it, but it's not really, it's not enough. So if you just say, oh, well, that's science. I know that bird, reproduces sexually. Like there needs a male and a female. Or that gecko reproduces parthenogenically or asexually. It just needs one, I guess not asexually, but parthenogenically. It just needs, females alone, no males, which is, there's geckos over there that are like that. And that could be an observation. But, if it's just an observation in the wild and you didn't run an experiment that was set up intentionally, that doesn't necessarily really mean that you're not following a systematic, correct approach to making observations and deductions or thinking. So thinking is this process that I identified a while back. I'm not the only one, because what I realized is eventually that it is the same exact pattern as the scientific method, which is, here, let's see here. Maybe I have it, maybe I don't. Here we go, we'll just go here. If you go to my website, sentientsingularity.com, and you go to models, you will see this model right come on. Huh. Thought it was here. Here, let me find it. This is very odd, but there is a pattern of thinking that is the same exact thing as the scientific method, which is that you have to assume the opposite of what your default assumption is to be true, and then look for evidence of that new assumption, essentially. So basically, it's like steel manning. It's which is exactly what the scientific method is. It's you have to propose this hypothesis, and the way that is structured kind of constrains you to getting a yes or no answer, essentially, and instead of being able to be free to change the question as you go, which is as you ask it, which really leads to an unanswered question. But here we go. Let's see here. Probably maybe here. I need to put it into, here we go, decision tree right here. This is it. I need to put it into my new document. Every few months I save this document and kind of make a new one. But this is the thinking code. It is the only way to think. And basically, you have will, okay? And will is the desire to do that which is not being done, which is kind of the foundation that is motivating this entire process. And this is, if you don't think this way, then you're not really thinking. You might be thinking that you're thinking, or like not thinking that you're thinking, but like tricking yourself into feeling like you're thinking is really what it is, but you're not really thinking. So, what is Elon Musk talks about reasoning by first principles and reasoning by analogy. This is true reasoning, I guess, or truth. It's the thinking process that you can use to test your reasoning, to see if you're reasoning by first principles or by just analogy. So let's say that you have a question and you want to ask it. And you're going to say something like, the question is, is the universe finely tuned by God? I guess. So this is the question that you want to ask, which is really, does God exist? That's the real question. But, or is the universe made for us, for a specific purpose? And if you believe it's not, like your default belief is your Sabine, okay? And her default belief, which we'll get into in a minute, is basically, she calls herself agnostic, but she's an anti-theist, I would say, is anti-theism, which is belief that the universe is, it did not start with a sentient being. It is not sentient itself, and sentience kind of comes from non-sentience. And there's lots of reasons why that I say this about her opinion. We've talked about her streams before on here. She believes you can make a measurement without an observer and things like that, which implies that she doesn't believe consciousness is fundamental. So at least not in the streams that we've seen. But so this would be her default status. She cannot assume that this is true, that anti-theism is true, and that it is not finely tuned. This would be her assumption if she was not thinking. The universe is not finely tuned. That would be her default assumption. She cannot think from this default assumption. She, because this is her actual default assumption, has to assume this. I don't think that this is a good thing to investigate, to be honest. I think a better question would be, or assumption would be like, the universe is made intentionally by a sentient being for a reason, I guess, for a purpose. So that would be like what she has to assume in order to approach the conversation that she's having tonight that we're going to discuss honestly and to think about it accurately. So now, because she's rejecting her default status, she's assuming the opposite of the default status is correct. So that she has to assume this is true now. And then she has to look for evidence for this assumption. Okay. And that is how you do that. And then there's this, statistical process that goes on in our minds of, is it usually true? Is it sometimes true? Is it always true? Is it not usually true? Is it rarely true? Things like that. But, we test things in science multiple times. And when you look at the scientific method, and that's not the scientific method. Scientific method is an empirical method of acquiring knowledge that has categorized or characterized the development of science since at least the 17th century. It involves careful observation, applying rigorous skepticism about what is being observed, given that the cognitive assumptions can distort how one interprets the observation. So you can't just be a skeptic. That's the problem. Skepticism doesn't work because you can't really be honestly skeptical about your own position without asserting a positive assumption that you're looking actively for evidence for that would be the counter to your default assumption. So you cannot be anti. This is why anything fundamental. This is why you cannot be an atheist. But if you're an anti-theist, then you end up becoming very often like adopting the same exact patterns of behavior that you assume from theists. And theists have that pattern of behavior sometimes. But or like a better example would be fascism or something. Anti-fascists become fascists, anti-racists become racist, etc. Because you can't be anti something that is that exists. You have to be pro something that exists, and then by emergently be anti. Okay, but if you start from an anti position, you're not really starting from a position. Your position is defined already by this position that you're claiming to be anti, that doesn't make sense, and it ends up leading to issues where anti-fascists become fascists and stuff, because you can't not be. You're defining your perspective by that which you are claiming to be anti, but you're still defined by it. You can't do that. You can't do that in science either, because you can't do that in thinking. And this is why kind of science or thinking or education, all of these things, they're kind of just merging into one, and the boundaries between them are just disappearing, because and it's not even enough to just say that science is a method unless you're just going to truly restrict it to that. But as soon as you're going to bring in observations and you're like, yeah, I'm observing that bird doing that, and therefore I now can assume, this about that bird because I've observed, something, a perspective, a behavior, whatever, that supports my initial hypothesis. So, but the way in which the scientific method is set up is meant to kind of take into account and overcome your biases that would be otherwise clouding you, which is why it says, here, applying rigorous skepticism about what's being observed. Skepticism is an anti-ideology in and of itself. If you're skeptical about anything, you are anti that thing. You disbelieve it. You are assuming it to be untrue. If you're skeptical about aliens or UFOs or ghosts or whatever, then you you are anti the existence of ghosts, anti the existence of UFOs, anti the existence of aliens, whatever. But you can't be skeptical, truly. Like, skepticism is this is not it. It doesn't build anything. It's a tear down mentality because it's not built on anything. So this is why you kind of steel manning is such a good way of putting, of framing these discussions much more so than like being skeptical, because you can't even be skeptical of your own opinion. You can't. It's your default assumption. So you have to assume the opposite of your default assumption is correct and look honestly for evidence that would be correct. You cannot assume your default assumption is correct and then look for evidence of it, because you already see evidence around you that you assume is evidence of what your default assumption is. Otherwise, you wouldn't have your default assumption. So you can't start from your own default assumption being assumed to be true. And this is how I came to theism, is I had to identify, when I was looking at general intelligence and AI, I had to identify how do you think and what is that process and of sense making. And then I ended up realizing that consciousness had to be fundamental, and I had to. And then one day I realized, I was like, does that mean that God would exist? And then I had always been an anti-theist, just self-described atheist, but truly an anti-theist. And then I had to assume that God existed and look for evidence of that. And God, but like a true definition of God, not like just, not a scriptural definition according to one theological tradition, which I'm not saying those are false, because I don't think that they are. I think they are true. Just saying that, that is very often, misunderstood. If you're an anti-theist, or a self-described atheist, and then you can't start from a scriptural definition of God, because you already, if that God does exist, then you're misinterpreting that what is meant by those scriptures when it defines God, because otherwise you would believe in it. So essentially, if you don't see evidence of God but you assume God's existence, then you have to assume that your definition of God is incorrect. And Kurt Munkel brought this up once to Jordan Peterson when he went on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and it is a very critical part of re-examining one's own atheism or anti-theism or agnosticism, if some people call it. But all those terms are only anti-theism is a term that makes sense for those. But we'll talk about that later. So, but the scientific method. See here, what are the steps? 7 steps. Make an observation. Ask a question. Form a hypothesis or testable explanation. Make a prediction based on the hypothesis. Test the prediction. And so this is kind of the externalization of the mechanization of this thinking code that I showed. And it's not as specific, though, at least not here, because you're not assuming the opposite of what your default assumption was, even though that was kind of how I remember being taught it in school often, but it's not stating that here. So let's see here. Hypothesis is not necessarily the right explanation. Instead, it's a possible explanation that we can test to see if it is likely correct, or if we need to make a new hypothesis. Can any explanation count as a hypothesis? A hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable in order to be valid for... okay, so... Test predictions. Interesting. So... that's the scientific method. Science, though, is become way more encompassing of a term or of a label for more than just that. It is, just making observations around you and recording them, the recording of observations. Like, you're out in the field and you're a biologist or an ecologist and you're looking at birds interactions and you're recording behaviors that you see, or you're, photographing them, videotaping them, whatever. Like that is that science? And I would say it is. But the problem is that it distorts the definition of science, which is, it becomes just, it's an it's anything that is objectively observed, but you can't objectively observe something. You subjectively observe something. That is just reality. And you either have to say it is science or it's not. And if it isn't, then we need to admit that things beyond science are part of the process that we call science, essentially. So, and they talk about that in here. I know I'm rambling a bit, but this is, it's tough because we don't have the words for this stuff, like I said, in many other streams. But this is the thinking process. If you ever want to think about something, this is what you should try and do. See if you are being honest. I don't want to say objective, but honest. Then this is how you should do it. Assume the opposite of your default assumption is correct, and then look for evidence of it. But you have to kind of steel man that. You can't use a straw man, easy to punch down version of what you oppose. You have to go with what people who disagree with you define that perspective that you disagree with to be, essentially. So you can't go with if you're an anti-theist or an atheist, you can't go with your definition of God, because you're not the one who is defining it as something that you believe in. You have to go with the definition of the person that you're, in a debate with or something. But honestly, you should be asking that question to yourself before you get into a debate over it. And then you would want to use the true definition, which is that sentience is fundamental and that existence itself is a singular sentient being that is the initial sentience that created multiplicity of sentience that we see around us in the universe. So that would be the starting point. So, but to ask scientific questions, though, is really what they are talking about in this stream. And so because we can't go and have an objective observation, we have only subjective observations, we have subjective perspectives. By definition, here is the subjective perspectives of Sabine and Luke Barnes.
So how did I get into this? I originally studied mathematics, and it turned out I was more interested by the question, how much can we learn from mathematics about the world, than by figuring out exactly, how mathematical structures themselves behave. So naturally, I ended up being in physics, mostly in the foundations of physics, researching this question, how much can we learn about the world using mathematics? And I worked for a little bit on quantum gravity, high energy particle physics. Now I do more astrophysics, as you just said. I also do a little bit foundations of quantum mechanics, so all that kind of stuff where mathematics is really the whole game, basically. I have a lot of interest related to this. I have an interest in the philosophy of physics. It's kind of very close by this whole research area. And as you said, I guess I have a creative urge. So every once in a while I sing.
It's fun. I've really enjoyed watching some of your videos. What about faith, Sabine? Has belief in God or any kind of faith ever figured in your life or not really?
Well, so I've grown up in Germany, and most people here are a Christian, either a Roman Catholic or a Protestant. My husband's whole family is Catholic. But I've grown up an atheist, and I've also never been Christianized. And for some while I considered attending church. So I attended mass for some time, and I liked the singing, but I couldn't really identify with it. So I would say that for what my profession as a scientist is concerned, I would identify as agnostic. I don't really have an opinion about it either way. But if you ask about the way that I live my life in practice, I don't belong to any religion. I don't attend church.
Sure. When you look at the night sky or some of the extraordinary things about our universe, does it ever inspire anything like religious awe in you, or would you describe it a different way?
I would say I don't really know what you're talking about. So I guess that means the answer is no. I mean, I find it totally amazing. I like to think about what's going on out there, and it always still blows my mind. If you try to imagine
Sure.
the size of the cosmos and all the stuff that's in there, but I don't associate anything religious with it.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good question, but I understand that. I was a self-described atheist until I was 24. I'm now 31, 32. I think 32. I don't know. I have to ask my wife. But I think I'm 32, actually. And I was always, people have asked me, before you were a theist, were you just pessimistic and nihilistic, and were you interested in the world, or did you find it boring? And I was always fascinated and amazed by the universe, by the world, by life. I have always been interested in animals and plants and biology and ecology and astronomy and technology, and I've always been fascinated by the world that we live in, and it's never not been amazing to me, whether I was a theist or an anti-theist. I don't think that being amazed by the world is something that is restricted to being a theist. I do think that there are certain instances in our lives that you can be much more amazed by, with having a theistic worldview, but those things that are chalked up to coincidences or amazing luck or versus, I don't want to say thank God, but if you those instances where people say thank God, whether they are theists or anti-theists, but when theists say it, they should mean it, versus when you're an anti-theist, you should not mean it. But I understand that it's a reflex. And those moments are the moments that change when you become a theist versus an anti-theist, or an atheist or agnostic, whatever you want to, not even whatever you want to call it. You are an anti-theist. If you call yourself an agnostic or an atheist, you're an anti-theist. You cannot have no assumption about the nature of existence. If you believe that the nature of existence is fundamentally sentient, you're a theist. If you believe this universe is created by a sentient being or is a sentient being, you're a theist. And if you don't, then you are an anti-theist. You're not an atheist lacking in opinion, because everybody interacts with the universe all day long. If you have a coincidence happen, I don't even know what's the proper way to use that word, but if you have something happen where the odds appear to have been very, very small, and it was, an amazing timing type of thing, do you assume that was intentional by the universe or not? If you assume that it is intentional, then you're a theist. But if you assume that was just luck, a complete luck, and that's it, random processes are responsible for that happening completely, then you would be an anti-theist. You're not an atheist. You believe that it's random. You don't say, oh yeah, I don't know if it's random or not. No, you believe that it's random, or you don't. Nobody has the assumption of, who knows, in every single instance of that happening in their life daily, which it happens almost daily to us. We just, sometimes more profound. But so I think that framing this conversation, all these conversations, is very important. That's why I harp on this term, anti-theist. Spread it around. It is correct, and it's not a derogatory term. If you don't believe that existence is fundamentally sentient, or that a sentient being is responsible for the multiplicity of sentience that we see, then you should be honest about it. And that's totally fine. It's not your fault if you have that position. As long as you're honest about your position, that's what matters. Don't claim to be a theist if you're not, and don't claim to be an anti-theist if you are a theist. That's all that matters. So anybody who's being honest should be admired, or that is an admirable thing to do for anyone. And but this is very important to framing this properly. You can't be an atheist. It sets you up to not have an honest discussion from there on, even with yourself. Like if you listen to Sam Harris and he's like, yeah, atheism it's a lack of an opinion. It's like, dude, you literally argue against God all the time. Like you can't say that you lack an opinion. Sam Harris, atheism. Let's see, definition. So, Journey to Atheism with Sam Harris. This was so long ago. It's on Big Think.
Strident criticism of religion is really a product of very recent events. In my case, it's September 11th, 2001. So it's my upbringing isn't so informative of my views at the moment. Well, it was two things. One, just the rather obvious liability of religious certainty was made extraordinarily clear on that day. And we were having people flying planes into our buildings for explicitly religious reasons. But what was also made clear is we were going to deny the religious rationale because of our own attachment to our own religious myths. And the only language we could find as a culture to comfort ourselves was to endorse our own God talk. So I suddenly saw faith playing both sides of the board in a very dangerous game, where we as a nation in prosecuting our war on terror, which was obviously a necessary thing to do, though calling it a war on terror I think is rather silly. But we were consoling ourselves with our own religious certainties, very much in the language of Christian fundamentalism. The president comes before Congress and talks about God not being indifferent to freedom and fear. As an atheist, I hear that exactly the way I would hear someone saying Zeus is not indifferent to freedom and fear. It is an uncannily strange and empty utterance. And yet our culture is now programmed not to notice how strange and empty it is, and upon which the lives and happiness of millions of people really turn, get subverted by religious thinking, explicitly religious thinking. Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about and exploring spiritual experience in our contemplative traditions, mostly in an Eastern context, in Buddhism and Hinduism, but I've also read much and interested in spiritual experience and have spent a lot of time practicing meditation and studying with various meditation masters in India and Nepal, and spending months and weeks on retreat just practicing meditation, very much the way a monastic would in the Buddhist tradition. So I'm the concerns of religious people, the ethical and the spiritual concerns of religious people are something that I think I understand and I take very seriously. And I take very seriously the possibility of experiencing the world the way Buddha and Jesus and other famous patriarchs and matriarchs seem to have experienced the world. And I think we want to actualize that kind of experience. I mean, if it's possible to love your neighbor as yourself, I'm interested in learning how to do that. I just don't think we have to believe anything on insufficient evidence in order to do that.
Okay, so I mean that's not actually the best explanation of his thoughts, but I mean atheism is the assumption of the lack of existence of God. Same thing. It's not a lack of belief on the existence of God. It is an assumption of a lack of existence of God. It is the belief of a lack of existence of God. Same thing with agnosticism. It's just not. You're just not brave enough. Is really what it comes down to. If you're saying you're agnostic, then you, in one circumstance, you'd probably be comfortable admitting you were an atheist. In another circumstance, which really means you're an anti-theist. There's only anti-theism and theism, and neither one is wrong to believe. You should believe what you think is true, but that doesn't mean that one of them is correct and the other one is. Or that they both are correct or they're both incorrect. One of them has to be correct and the other one has to be incorrect, logically. But it's not a matter of religion, and Sabine talks about this where she's like, I wasn't Christianized. Most people around me are Christian. They're either Protestant or they're Catholic. And this is the issue with theism right now, I think, is even though I am somebody who is a believer in the divinity of Scripture, of the main three Abrahamic traditions in the world, I do not think that is a helpful thing to inject into the scientific discussion. Really, at least in the physics and biology type of discussions. But that doesn't mean you can't eventually study the science of these religions, which you can, I think, do, but we need a new term for it, I think. But I think Kurt Mungel uses the term Weltanschauung, I think I pronounced it correctly, for an all-encompassing theory of life, which for most theists that are true theists who also subscribe to a specific religion, it would be like a specific religion. So they'd say Islam is my Weltanschauung, or Christianity or something, Judaism. But I think that people try and do that with science, but the problem is that we have contradictory narratives about what that means. So it doesn't actually. It's used to attempt to answer questions that it cannot answer because the questions are framed wrongly, because it's starting from an assumption that is false. So, like, what is the meaning of life? What is the origin of life? It assumes that there's an origin of life. It assumes that life isn't that life is properly defined, and therefore there was an origin moment for cellular life, and that is the moment that we're looking for. And it kind of ignores the context of that if life should actually be defined more broadly. But it's more, I would say, more, not even just more broadly, more super specifically, which is, life is sentience, really is the question that we're trying to ask, is what is the origin of sentience? But if sentience always existed, then that's not a good question either. But you could say, where is the origin of the multiplicity of sentience? But the problem is that if you ask that question, then you already know the answer. So, like, these things are difficult because sometimes there isn't actually the right question, but you can just get closer to the right question. And then by the time that you think that you've gotten the right question, you've actually answered the question in the question, and therefore it's a non-question. Like, what is the origin of sentience? If you believe that sentience is fundamental, then you can't really ask that question. So if you asked where is the origin of multiplicity of sentience, well, you would say that the origin is in singularity of sentience. So, like, it answers itself, is what I'm trying to say. That question specifically. I messed up reiterating it, but produced videos coming soon. I have made a list of topics. We're going to do one a month starting next month, ideally. If not, then definitely July. And same thing with interviews. But so you can tell, though, she has this very narrow framework of God and therefore theism, and that is where she's operating from. So the next guy.
Okay, well, maybe
Luke
we'll return
Barnes.
to some of those sorts of questions later on in the show, but I'm really looking forward to unpacking
some of the science behind this as well, and with Luke, of course, our other guest on the show today. Luke, bit of background to yourself. How did you end up researching dark matter and multiverses and all the interesting stuff you do, and of course the fine-tuning of the universe for life? How did you come into that particular field?
Well, I started off as a more respectable astrophysicist, just doing things like how galaxies form. Cosmology was always an interest. I grew up as a bit of a dinosaur nerd, but again, through maths, just wanted to realise this was a way to understand the world. But I had heard about this sort of field of fine-tuning, books by Barrow and Tipler and Paul Davis and a bunch of other people, and so just started reading the scientific literature on this and got fascinated in it, and then sort of realised there were ways to contribute to that field by looking at various ways that life depends on the fundamental constants of nature.
Brilliant. Tell me about your own faith commitments. And do they at any level sort of impact the science that you do?
So I'm a Christian. I grew up in a Christian household, and sort of towards the end of teenage years, obviously an interest in science. There's a whole lot of people who, were saying that, these two things couldn't be held together. So I started reading a whole bunch of stuff by atheists. There's a whole bunch of Dawkins behind me and such. And at the end of that, still had my faith. I still go to church and all those sorts of things. It inspires me to investigate the world, because the world's an amazing place, and for me, an amazing creation. So, but beyond that, apart from a very deep belief that the universe is ultimately a rational place, beyond that, science and science is really just sort of the world. My Christian faith is really the worldview in which I do science, rather than anything that specifically turns up in a theory. I never answered God on any of my physics exams.
That's good and well, but I think eventually we will have to answer God on a physics exam. if there is an initial action, then there is an initial actor. Sentient singularity theory seems to imply that, to me, that gravity is a conscious action by the universe itself, moving, just like you moving to pick up a water bottle from your desk because you've been speaking so long, your mouth is dry. That is an intentional action that is moving and kind of even spinning the multiplicity of sentient beings that is your cells, all towards a center point. But it is gravity, I think. We are cells inside an organism, and we're seeing gravity, which is the movement of that being. It's an intentional movement. And I think that there are ways to test this, but it won't prove it, because you can't go beyond yourself. Or we can't all do that together on our own, Can't just choose to do it. Can't just choose to go see beyond this universe. But even if it's possible to be shown it by God, it's not for you to decide to just go do that, because it involves you transcending your own levels of sovereignty. And a cell cannot just exit the body and look at everything from the same perspective as you, as the singularity of sentience that is, built of the assembly of cells that you have, and then just go, back to being a cell. Maybe it's possible somehow, some way, but it's not for it to do on its own. It doesn't get to make that choice. Maybe you can find a way to show it. And I know there's some weird advancements being proposed and made that I think are actually very promising with, cancer research and things like that. With oh my gosh, what's his name? I'm blanking on it. I always do this during the streams. I forget everybody's names, but there is a guy who we've talked about before on here, who is doing plenty of research on cancer and also xenobots. What is it? I have to get his name. Michael Levin, that's him. And I think from what I understand, his research involves reorienting the cell's perspective to some degree towards like the whole, and that you could argue is kind of showing it a God's eye view, a human eye view. But I do think that answering God to the to anything in physics, any physics questions, is not rigorous. So I don't do that. I don't think that we should be answering scientific endeavor questions that we have proposed in scientific endeavors with scripture, even if scripture is true. And it's not the same language, and it doesn't have exactly the same purpose either. So I think I don't want to say that we should keep theism separate, because you can't. I will say this as someone who is involved in a scientific pursuit. I don't want to call myself a scientist, even though who is a scientist? I do all kinds of experiments, and I've been studying, with biologists in the field for years and zoologists in captivity for years, and I'm now working on metaphysics, models and theories. That's a little harder to call science until there's a proposed experiment, but I am working on that. So is that a scientist? Yeah, I guess you could say that, but I'm doing science. That's a better way. I don't like calling, there's scientists and not scientists. No, are you participating in a scientific endeavor? Yes, I'm doing that. So, but my theism orients me in that. It allows me to ask better questions. It allows me to make better predictions. Very much so. Your ability to make predictions extends so much further if you assume theism than if you assume anti-theism, because anti-theism it's not an assertive assumption. It's not a positive foundation to build on. It's just the assumption that there isn't a foundation to build. So good luck building on that assumption. But I've noticed this when I ask myself questions about, I don't know, the universe, that questions that I couldn't have normally answered when I was a self-described atheist. I can see that there's more to this question that I'm asking, and that I could get an answer, even if I don't get it immediately. But whereas when I was a self-described atheist, a lot of times you ask these big questions, and it's just like, well, could be like this, maybe it's like this, maybe it's 11 dimensions in hyperspace, maybe there's 13 dimensions, maybe there's 14 dimensions, maybe there's 65 dimensions, and maybe it's all made of strings, maybe it's not, maybe it's made of particles, maybe we're inside black holes that are breeding, there's just this endless we don't know. So it could be anything, which really means like you don't have any direction or orientation. But if you're starting from a positive assumption, then you can actually have direction and orientation. So you can answer way more questions in my experience. But, if I'm wrong, I would hope that anti-theists can show us that you can make, more, you have better predictive ability with that assumption. The problem is that most people who are focused on God are focused on Scripture and not focused on the sciences. But I do see this changing. This was not always the case. Most of our most celebrated pioneers in the scientific pursuits were all theists until very recently. And I think that a lot of the people who were anti-theists or self-described atheists in the more recent years, who have made solid contributions to the scientific endeavor, they have made much less comprehensive, much more specific contributions than we currently even realize, I think. Even the Darwinian narrative of evolution. I'm not saying Darwin was an anti-theist. I actually think he was a theist. But the narrative that we've plucked from his, his work is now in an anti-theist perspective. It is. Evolution is a counter to creationism, which it's not.
Well, it's great to have you both on the show.
Okay, so next clip. This is tough to talk about because there's so much framework that you have to bring into this. You have to bring in all the issues with science if you can, which most people can't. I can't say I can bring in all of them, but I can bring in more than most, and I say that honestly. You also have to bring in the default assumptions of everybody involved in the discussion. It's just a necessary thing if you want to make progress. But most of these discussions don't make any progress. But we can make progress by examining them. So the next clip, talking about fine-tuning. Fine-tuning, like I said before, I do not actually think fine-tuning is a good argument for the existence of God. When you look at the fundamental world, you move beyond relativity, you move beyond probability, which is just the appearance of relativity in mathematics. And it's not fundamental probability. So because of that, the fine-tuning argument falls apart, because if you're dealing with theism, and the concepts involved with that, you're dealing on a fundamental level, and you're not dealing on this relativistic level where, for the most part, where you would have probability come into play. I say this all the time on this channel. When I see something happen, or if we see some kind of coincidence, I say, what are the odds of that? Probably 100%. And I say that in my daily life to friends and family and stuff at this point. And something I came up with as I investigated reality more, and realized, how probability wasn't fundamental. It's about intentionality. So what are the odds that I picked up this water bottle just now, or that I was going to pick it up? Probably 100%. Like, it's funny because it's just saying probably, but if I decide not to pick it up, the odds are 0 that I'm going to pick it up. If I decide to pick it up, the odds are probably 100% that I'm going to pick it up, absent intervention. So But the fine-tuning argument is the argument that are mathematical constants that are responsible for the state of physics and many other, things that we are probably as of yet unaware of in chemistry and biology and beyond. It's so unlikely that it was just had to be that our universe had just the right constants for life, which it makes an assumption of life that I think is wrong. That it means that it was an intentional action, and because if it was random, then it was likely to be anything else. But that's not actually the way, even absent from a willful universe or from the existence of God, mathematics and determinism itself, which is not contrary to free will, it is dependent. They are dependent concepts. Free will or choice depends upon causality and inevitable causalities in order to actually make a choice. You have to know that choosing that path is going to cause that, and that means that that the laws have to be mathematically deterministic to some degree, but they are still put into motion by sentient beings, and that there are two sides of one coin, is what I'm saying. But that means, if that's the case, that means that you can't use the odds would have been so, the odds of that constant being exactly what it is, and that constant being exactly what it is, to allow for life to exist in this universe was so, infinitely low that therefore, which is, that doesn't make sense anyways, to say infinitely low, that it implies that it was an intentional action, most likely. It's like, no, not even causality outside of God is like that. If there is no God, the odds that the universe's constants would be what they are is probably 100%. And if there is a God, the odds that the universe's constants would be what they are is probably 100%. And if it was 0%, then it would not be, they wouldn't be, what they are. So that is the main argument against fine-tuning. But also, when you look at the universe and you map it just the way, to the degree that I have tried to do, and I've spoken to Eric Weinstein even about this, is that it appears like there was only one way to make this universe. If you take everything into account that I think you must take into account, and apparently, according to his thinking as well, which I'm not saying is exactly the same as mine, I'm not saying he's taking everything into account that I'm taking into account, but whatever he is taking into account, he has also come to the same conclusion that it appears like there was really only one way to make the universe. God didn't have a choice in the laws of nature. His choice was in whether or not to make multiplicity and make the universe, but it was not in how it would be made. And that is apparent in my models as well, which we're not going to get into tonight, but that implies that the constants are inevitable. And that means fine-tuning is not accurate. Plus, if everything is fundamentally sentient, if sentience is fundamental, is what I'm trying to say, and sentient beings are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, which is what sentient singularity theory assumes, and what theism actually, I would say, assumes as well, then that means that, a correct first principles, deduced version of theism, it means that the fine-tuning argument also falls apart there, because sentience is the constraint. It's not that the universe is optimized for sentience. It is that there is no other thing to make it in existence other than other sentient beings. now we might see things that are non-sentient, like water bottles and stuff, but that's a subjective observation of things that are not fundamental. So, like an atom would be fundamental, or a proton or something. Even you, an organism or cell, this nested hierarchy or lineage of holonic self-referencing structures, but not the things that we see, like water bottles and scissors and stuff like that. So there's so much wrong with the fine-tuning argument. I think it's terrible, actually. So, you know, theism does not, it's not a good argument for theism. It's actually, it's an incorrect argument.
Numbers were different. What would happen if there was a universe, and when you describe these universe in laws, there was the same laws as ours, but these numbers were different. And there's numbers like the cosmological constant, which is a sort of an accelerating influence on space, or a decelerating influence on space, to put it roughly. There's a sort of range that this number could have in our theories between what are called the Planck limits, of if we wanted to go outside of those limits, we'd need a quantum theory of gravity, and we don't really have a successful one of those at the moment. But within those limits, almost all of the universes are kind of disastrous. So if the number is too large and positive, the universe expands so fast that no structure forms, no protons ever sort of get together into nuclei or anything. If it's too negative, then the universe recollapses in less than a second or something. And within the total range, the limits that avoid those two sort of catastrophes is sort of 1 part in about, even very conservatively, 10 to the 90 at most. We can also talk about the sort of typical scale of the particles, the masses of the particles we're made of. There's a number called the Higgs vacuum expectation value. It has a certain value in our universe. It could, in the equations, go between 0 and, again, this Planck limit. And on that scale, you've got to land between, the numbers are 6 times 10 to the minus 18 and about 3 times 10 to the minus 17. So, you know,
all this is like, it's like finding a car that's already put together and being like, if that engine was too powerful, it would rip the car apart. And if it was smaller, it wouldn't be able to push it. And therefore, someone must have made the car. And it's missing the fundamental assumption of purpose. There is a purpose to this universe, but that must be assumed as a secondary assumption on top of the assumption that it was created by a sentient being. So and most people, you know, if they're not a theist, they're not able to get there because they're stuck at, you know, is the universe created by a sentient being, or is the universe a sentient being? They're not at the point of, is the universe created for the purpose of, you know, intentionally for some purpose by a sentient being. Like, you have to get there already. And until they do, like, they're gonna have to, if they wanted to actually approach that question, they'd have to make intentional, multiple assumptions that are contrary to their default opinion on it. And that's a problem, because if they are trying to look at this honestly, if they think that it's false, this idea that the universe was created by a sentient being, or it is a sentient being, then whatever that perspective is, if it is a sentient being, or if it was created by a sentient being and they're wrong, then the issue is that if they assume that that it was created by a sentient being, or that it is a sentient being, even though they're not, they're just doing it for the sake of argument, it means that viewpoint of that perspective that they have, that they're now bringing into this next level of questioning, is already false. So you should not ever want to do that. You shouldn't want somebody to even try to do that, because if you can get them to see the logic in that on a deep level, then it means that they're building it on a false foundation that they've built that they didn't actually come to assuming honestly on the first level. So that's why your subjective observations and your subjective perspectives and assumptions matter to the scientific process, because we are the ones who the scientific process is running through and are responsible for generating and continuing and fueling and enacting that scientific process. So like you can't just say that it's just this detached thing and my opinion doesn't matter and I can just assume this for the sake of argument, and then I'll assume this argument for the sake of the next argument. You can't do that. Maybe you can do it one level, but it's for the sake of trying to understand the level even below that. It's not for the sake of trying to understand the level above that. You're trying to understand the preceding circumstances that are responsible for the position that you're now assuming for the sake of argument. You're not trying to understand the succeeding circumstances that are the result of the assumption of what you are now assuming, which would be the result of the assumption that you have not yet actually honestly formed, that is preceding that. So like there is no way for science to be not incorporate subjectivity and the constraints of subjectivity into it. And if you're going to attack, especially if you're going to attack fundamental questions and fundamental structures and fundamental understandings of things on a fundamental level, like you can't be super isolated. It's all connected and built on each other. So it's like you can't build a house from the top down. Like you have to build it from the bottom up if you're going to build the whole house. If you're just going to learn how to build a window, then sure, who cares if the foundation of the house that this window would go in is solid or existent or not. But if your plan is to try and actually build the house, like you need to start at the foundation. You cannot start at the top. So I don't like the fine-tuning argument. Probably make a video that incorporates that topic in the future that is not live. But when we're getting back to what science is, they explain in this next clip, they say science is,
if we saw
to some degree, its goal is to explain the unlikelies. And again, not if we're talking about fundamental reality. And you can't say that theism is not, cosmology is considered part of science. And cosmology is connected to physics and astronomy and biology and chemistry. I mean, all kinds of things. I mean, these are all connected things. So you can't isolate them really anymore if we want to move forward in science. You just can't. The problem is that we have to make changes in how multiple fields kind of interpret things and view things. What this really means, I think, as I've been thinking a lot about this, is like, how do we actually reorient the scientific endeavor again? I think we have to make a new community that has basic assumptions built into it that are, true. And different communities are going to have different basic assumptions, and maybe they're competing, but whichever one has their basic assumptions to be true, then that community is going to have more of a success in its scientific pursuits. But the thing is, or its engineering pursuits, which is the same thing. It's just another part of this process of understanding and interacting. But we really need to, I think, form a completely new, we need a fractured scientific endeavor until one of them succeeds to an obvious degree, and then everybody can come back to joining that, hopefully with an understanding. Not everybody, but then people can pick which one makes sense. But to just try and change academia, I don't think it's going to happen, even though I see so many people with, PhDs who are talking about this stuff, and they're starting to get there and realize that we're not discussing things properly. You have Sarah Walker talking about life, and life, even approaching the question of cellular life, is it going to manifest in multiple instances throughout the universe? Do we know what life is? Like, these are, or would cellular life only manifest once initially, in one instance, which I think sentient singularity theory would actually imply is accurate. But she mentioned this on Lex Fridman's podcast a long time ago. She said that even the idea that, if there's that many planets and that many solar systems, then of course, if life happened here, then it would happen somewhere else. And she was like, we don't know what life is, and also maybe that's not actually how this works. It's not just probabilistic. It is 100% or nothing. It would happen there and nowhere else. And it's what she basically proposed as being possible, and I think she's correct. That's consistent with my work. It seems to be more consistent with my work. But this is tough. I don't know how we move forward. Honestly, I'm just trusting. It's funny. Kurt Jaimungal has this shirt on his website, and I thought about ordering it. I think you definitely check out his merch. Support that channel. He does great work. But this shirt, don't thrust your toe, trust your toe. And that was that just rings so true with basically any of these fundamental ideas, like the multiverse hypothesis, or string theory, or theism, or sentient singularity theory, the CTMU. I don't know if the geometric unity applies, because I don't know how fundamental it really is, but it's more fundamental than our current theories, it seems. But don't thrust your toe, trust your toe. And I think that instead of trying to convince everybody else that they're wrong, it's better to just show what we can do with the perspective that we have, and build. And if you build it, they will come, maybe, and maybe not, and it's fine if they don't. But I don't think that trying to convince others of to change their fundamental worldviews is really a productive or even moral kind of pursuit, depending on how you do it, obviously. I mean, if you can show why these perspectives seem to be positive and good and helpful and useful and apparently accurate in the way that you go about your life, and people come to it naturally, then I think that that's fine. That's a good thing. I think you should show what you have, talk about it, but that doesn't mean that you should try and be, shoving it down people's throats. I think that will lead to terrible consequences. This is why I don't think that it's a good thing if we got all of academia to start teaching sentient singularity theory or something like that. If we could convince them to adopt this theory, or that would just not be a good idea. Or even geometric unity. We should be trying to talk to the people, make connections that it's useful to talk to about these theories, and who can help us build with them, not shove them down people's throats without that adoption being natural. It's certain theories get adopted because they're able to allow you to expand your capabilities and your competence and your predictive power and things like that. And then you can show that, but you don't need to. If you're not even at that point, then why are you trying to convince people of your theory by shoving it down people's throats? I've never emailed my theory to any PhDs out there who work in academia. and that is more of. They talk about it in here. They talk about it on every physics podcast at this point, where just physicists say that they get inundated with all these emails. Oh, I have the theory. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But like that's not the way to go about convincing anyone of anything. Honestly, the people that you will convince are the people who are convinced of anything, not convinced of something because of its elegant truth and its the capability that it affords, but because they are just easily convinced of anything, like manipulatable. Like you don't want those people to be, with you leading whatever movement you have. So I've definitely, I think, realized this very early on. This message: don't trust your toe. Don't thrust your toe. Trust your toe. I do not know where this project is going to go with sentient singularity theory, but I've always kind of trusted that if it's accurate, it will go somewhere. And it's not like nobody's going to know the truth in the end anyways. Everybody's going to know the truth in the end anyways, whatever it is. If I'm right, if I'm wrong, if you're right, if you're wrong, whatever. The truth will out. But it's... So we just, I think that even should change the way that we approach these things. Like, I talk about the education system all the time. I don't wish the education system taught sentient singularity theory in the classroom. That would be horrible. Horrible. It's like one of my greatest fears with this theory is that it ends up being kind of adopted as true due to the predictive abilities it has with experiments and things like that. And then some of it is taught in school via secondhand information, to people who didn't internalize it. And then they teach it to people who don't internalize it. And they teach it to people who don't internalize it. And it's just totally misconstrued and becomes some horrible, hollowed out, false version of what it originally was. That should be a concern of everybody with a fundamental theory. You shouldn't be concerned that, what if they don't adopt it into academia? Concern should be, what if they do? But I know, side rant, but it's kind of relevant. But yeah, explaining the unlikelies. That is not the role of science, especially not science attempting to understand the fundamental. It's not about the unlikelies. It's about the possible and the impossible. And then given and what would be intentional and absent, not even unintentional. But you could say unintentional, but it's not really unintentional. There's no such thing as unintentional. But there's just, you might not be the one intending for something to happen, but someone is intending always for something to happen. But here is Sabine talking about the multiverse and science versus unscientific ideas.
Principle in physics.
Other people seem to be, engaging with that idea, but you're quite critical of that, aren't you?
Well, the multiverse is not a principle. It's a hypothesis, and it's not a scientific hypothesis. And yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated. The fine-tuning argument is not the only argument that people bring up in favor of a multiverse, but it's certainly one of them. And yeah, it's kind of similar. So people are saying, well, we do observe these constants of nature. That's arguably correct. And then they say, well, we want to have an explanation for that. Like, why do the values have the values that they have? And that's fine with me. That's what science is all about. You want an explanation. Then they say, well, the multiverse is this explanation. And that's there where my problem begins, because it doesn't explain anything. In the scientific sense, it doesn't explain anything. And why do they think it explains something? Is because they've constructed a problem which is unscientific to begin with, which is this fine-tuning argument. There's just, as you summarized it correctly, we can't change these constants, therefore we don't know anything about the probability of that ever happening, so there's nothing in need of an explanation.
I actually halfway really agree with her on this. I don't know how to exactly say this, and then I'll get to the chat, but I know it's been a bit. But you can know the probability of those things, I would say. And the true constants, I think, in nature would be ratios, some kind. And any constants that we observe that are true constants would be constants that are the result. They're just the numerical expression of a ratio, but it's the ratio that is the constant. If there is a God that is fine-tuning things, he's balancing things, which means like if something gets a little too much over here, he needs to balance it out over here, and as he balances, it creates. He's maintaining the status of certain ratios that are requirements for the generation of logos or the continuity of creation, and that would result in the perception of certain constants, the golden ratio and things like that. But pi. But I think actually irrational numbers are the ones that you would really see this in, because it implies that for a number to be irrational, it implies that it's ever changing. It implies that there is a ratio that exists that is attempting to be maintained, but is in a constant state of change, which is why you have the resulting irrational numbers. So like pi. Pi is a ratio that is attempting to be maintained by God, and in his attempt to maintain it, we would perceive pi, which is an irrational number, which is honestly an ever-changing number, is what it is. It's a constantly changing number. But it is changing only slightly because it's really an attempt to overall, beyond time, even in a completely simultaneous experience where God is seeing everything at once, the past, the present, the future, kind of that from that perspective, it's not an ever-changing number, but he is experiencing that constant and maintaining that constant, and in doing so through because there's multiple sentient beings at play here, and we're changing, he's changing, we're all making choices, he's making choices, cells are making choices, maybe molecules and atoms and hadrons are making choices. In those instances, especially where choices are made that are not would not be in alignment with God's intention, then he would have to make some type of correction, which would imply that the number would have to be shifted a bit. But really, it's like it's just a constant ratio being maintained. It's fascinating, but it's like you're trying to maintain a balanced scale constantly. That's the constant, is the balanced scale. But if you're constantly adding also weight to both of those sides of the scale, then you're going to have to add here, then 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 add here, and it's just it would, from our perspective, subjectively look like an ever-changing number, which would really look like a never-ending number that is unpredictable. It's not a continuous, infinite decimal that is repeating a specific pattern. It's intentional. God is intentionally changing, balancing things in those constants like pi. That is fascinating. And that, I think, is true. I think it's logically inevitable that that's kind of true. What else would be responsible for, like, the existence of an irrational number? Like, think about that. That's a much better argument, I think, actually, for the existence of God is irrational numbers. I have on my YouTube channel, I don't know if it's called that, but I think it was called it used to be called God is an Irrational Number, but it might be called Science of the Messiah at this point. Maybe it's still called God is an Irrational Number. It's one of my first videos I uploaded, and it's from a previous YouTube channel that accidentally got deleted. And it talks about how God is kind of an irrational number, but it's really that irrational numbers are observed due to God consciously acting to try and maintain a specific ratio of some type, trying to maintain balance. That's fascinating. It's so much better of an argument. Even you could say for the fine-tuning, it is kind of the fine-tuning argument, but it's not the fine-tuning argument because it's not just a constant that is a static constant that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a specific ratio that is an irrational number. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about, the constant of, I don't know, 137 or something, or approximately. But maybe that is an irrational number if it's approximate. What's it called? Alpha constant. Let's see here. Nearly equal to 137. Defined structure constant. It's like you can't narrow it down completely because it's like irrational, I think. Even if it's not. Is the fine structure constant an irrational number? Let's see here. Fine structure constant irrational. Is a dimensionless physical constant. It is approximately equal to the rational number 137. However, alpha does not have an exact value. So it is neither rational nor irrational. So yeah, that does imply where if you say it doesn't have an exact value, that is, I think, irrational, but it's like it might be different. Maybe irrational numbers are like that, and that, but not all numbers that are like that are irrational. I don't know. I need to think more about it after reading this. But I mean, if it doesn't have an exact value, that means that it's like ever changing, and that does imply kind of a God that is balancing things constantly. But just the idea that because it's a precise number, in fact, you would say it's the opposite of the normal argument for the fine-tuning argument, which is fine-tuning argument. Fine-tuning arguments, which the universe is fine-tuned for life, are aimed at showing that life could not have existed for the vast majority of other forms of nature, and if the constants of nature were different. But it's like, but you're talking about if the number was different and it wasn't exactly that number. I don't know which number is the best one to focus on with the fine-tuning argument, because I don't think that it's the best argument. But if it's not an exact number and it's a constant that is like alpha, or like the fine structure constant, which is approximately 137, but not exactly, but it doesn't have an exact number, which means it's ever changing. That's what that means. That is evidence of God, I think. There's no way to prove God, but that is evidence of God. But to say that, because it's so precise and it's exactly what it needs to be, and it could have been any other number, and that's why God, no, that's not a good argument. But, a number that doesn't have an exact value, but is woven into the mathematics of the construction of everything around us, that is evidence of God, because it implies that there's someone intentionally balancing the scales constantly, and someone is also tripping the scales constantly. And so we throw the scale off, and God has to rebalance it constantly. Probably is what's happening. I wonder if at a certain point in the universe's evolution, if we're no longer throwing the scales off, would there be an exact number to the fine structure constant in that state, that like the Messianic era could say. In the Messianic era, is there an exact number to the fine structure constant? That is a fascinating question. I've never asked that question. But I realize this got a bit off topic, but it's not really. It's still on the fine-tuning argument. Here. This next clip is about falsifiability.
Of some very fundamental questions about the universe. So if we're talking about the fine-tuning argument, I take the fine-tuning argument to be a sort of an extension of a very basic, it's not even an argument, it's just kind of an instinct. Why do most people who've ever lived and still live believe that there's a God? Well, one of the reasons might be if you look around at the universe and there are various bits and pieces of it that seem to fit well together in a way that you might think, needs a mind. And that's a very sort of basic way of putting the world together and seeing if that makes sense of it. And it seems that it does make sense of it. There's various things around us that seem like that. So the question is now, what happens when science starts to inform the way that we actually understand the world? Well, on a first level, finding that the world is more intricately put together than our first observations show seems to strengthen that intuition. If you think a hummingbird is amazing, then zooming out and seeing the whole of an ecosystem, or looking back in time at the processes that brought the hummingbird into existence, or zooming in on the sort of the biological details of a hummingbird, all of that is just more amazing stuff. And so if you want to try and make this sort of instinct really secure, you might say, okay, let's go as deep as we can and try to work out whether the universe that we see is the sort of place that looks kind of thrown together at random, Bertrand Russell saying we're all accidental collocations of atoms, or whether there is something remarkable about the way the universe is at its most fundamental level. And what fine-tuning suggests is there's a systematic way of doing this. Why don't we go to the fundamental laws of nature, and when we look at those, there are these numbers that you just have to put in that the equation doesn't give you. Why don't we systematically change those as much as we can and try and work out what would happen and see if there is something remarkable about the way the universe is, as opposed to ways the universe could have been. So the fact that there aren't, that's a counterfactual statement, other things, the way the universe could have been. So I think in that context, what fine-tuning is trying to do, it's trying to answer that question, is there anything remarkable about the way the universe is rather than the ways that it could have been but isn't? And a systematic way of looking through those is let's change these constants. And when you do that, these other possibilities are just kind of, as best we know, possibilities.
See, there's so many problems with this stuff. This is why you can't just reform our current education system and start teaching like sentient singularity theory or something, or the perspective of kind of scientific theism, or like I guess scientific theism. I guess you could call it that, but because there's so many issues with even the statements, the questions that he's saying, like. You can't say, first of all, I was more amazed with the universe when I was a self-described atheist than pretty much anyone that I knew who was a self-described theist. And I didn't know that many theists who I interacted with that much, but even the ones that I did know, I was more amazed by the world than they were. At least it seemed like it. But I also knew plenty of self-described atheists that did not seem to be that amazed by the world like I was. And so being something amazing, something remarkable, like, I don't think that is actually, if I'm being honest, I don't think that that's a good way of framing it. It's straw manning the other side. It's like, oh, well, if we're just a ball of dust and it's unremarkable. No, if we're just our ball of dust and this was just due to random happenstance and luck, which I don't believe in any of these things, that's the reason for all of us being here, that is still amazing. That's incredible. It's almost more it is more unlikely. It's because it's impossible, I would say. It's not even just unlikely, it's impossible. But if it was possible and it did occur, it's a more unlikely set of circumstances than if this wasn't all intentional. It is, absolutely, because of many, things. You're getting into the realm of fundamental, which is the realm of absolutes, though. It's like, it either could happen that way or it could not. It's not, maybe sometimes it happens this way, sometimes it doesn't, and it's just a matter of luck. Like, that is, you're in relativity, and you're making lots of assumptions about fundamental reality that are probably wrong. But just for the sake of talking about this, you can't even frame it in the way of that he just did, whereas like that's maybe there's something remarkable about the universe if it was intentionally constructed, is what he's saying. Well, yeah, that is remarkable, but it's also remarkable if it wasn't. Like, maybe, what does remarkable mean? I think it means like shocking, I guess. Like, remarkable definition means worthy of attention, striking, like extraordinary. Like, that is, of course, it would be extraordinary and remarkable even if this was all due to random processes. So you can't say maybe there's something remarkable about our universe. Maybe it's just a dust ball that, we're just blobs from a lightning bolt or something. Like, you're just like the ultimate straw man of the other side as kind of presenting it as like this, like, as this kind of boring thing. But even though I think that's wrong, that the side of this was just accidental luck, like, you can't even say accident because it implies someone can do something accidentally, but like, things don't happen by accident if there's no intentionality that is on the side of it. But still, it's not unremarkable. Like, it's still remarkable. Why do you think people who are self-described atheists, who believe in randomness, continue to study biology? Because they think it's amazing, and that's fine. Like, I do think it's more inspiring to know that once you have an accurate perception of the intentionality behind this universe, because now this universe has a purpose and it's not done. It's a process, and the end of that process is inevitable. But you also have choice within it, but still the overall process is inevitable, and it's good, and like, that's inspiring compared to, we're just gonna, maybe one day we'll just have a big crunch where the universe just kind of condenses into a hot ball and everything and everyone just dies and vaporizes in a super hot black hole, essentially. Or it just a big freeze where it continues to expand apart completely, and all the stars burn out and we all just freeze to death, and it was all for nothing. Like, that isn't inspiring, but that doesn't mean it's not remarkable either, or like, interesting. To some people it is, but so it's just important that we frame this accurately. But the problem, again, is that most people who are theists have been so, and who are kind of well versed in scripture and theism as a overarching idea, but also within these specific traditions. But then they're not; those people are not usually also very scientifically well versed, and the people who are scientifically, interested in the scientific endeavor, I would say, scientifically inspired, those people are usually not deeply involved in scripture. But that is changing, is that a few of those people are definitely coming through. And that, like I said, that wasn't always the case. It was, in fact, the case was normally the opposite. People who were inspired by God were also inspired by the laws of nature, and they were not separate things. They were just understanding God and his creation and how amazing that is. And, you know, most of our best scientific, minds that we've ever had, who have made, you know, been the most revolutionary people and contributed the most, have all been theists. But recently, that has not been the case. And so we have a very distorted, false worldview, and probably from our education system being so out of context. But yeah, like this, it might sound like I'm ripping on, you know, the theist in this. I'm not ripping on anyone. I don't think that the fine-tuning argument in general is a good argument. I think there's much better arguments for and much better evidence for the existence of God. If you watch my video that I did for Kirchheim Mungel's Pace 1 contest, Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide, I explain how we can deduce fundamental assumptions about reality from which to build from. And those fundamental assumptions and that deductive process is the best evidence of God that exists, other than you perceiving God. And even then, I don't think that if you did perceive God and you hadn't gone through that process, that you would necessarily even draw the right conclusions from that experience. You might just be like, yeah, I'm schizophrenic, and now I'm going to go take medication or something. Or I took a drug, so I just hallucinated it and it was fake. Or, you know, whatever. Hit my head, so this was just a random dream while I was passed out. Like, you're going to deduce something from it that would be explaining it away, maybe. But you need to have the logical framework there that existence fundamentally is sentient in nature, and that there is one existence that exists, which means there's a single sentient being at the bottom and at the top of this, and at the center of this universe, this cosmos that we exist in. This is quite an exciting conversation. Thank you for making it live. You're welcome. I appreciate you being here. I do this for live people in the chat. It is what inspires me to keep coming back every week, but at least partially, it's a huge factor. If it wasn't live, it's much harder for me to be consistent. Hopefully, we'll see how I do with the produced videos, but we'll see. But how do you feel about the sentiment that we humans are the universe's means of experiencing itself? We are. We're just not the only ones. The universe experiences itself through cells, through humans, through probably sentient molecules if they are sentient, or sentient atoms if they are sentient, hadrons if they are sentient, which sentient singularity theory implies that all of these could possibly be sentient. So, like, the universe is experiencing itself through sentient lineages as well, which, you are a single sentient being, but so is a lineage. It is a being that is, its maneuvering is in individuals, but through time, whereas an individual is maneuvering in space in relationship with other sentient beings. So it's all of these, any instance of sentience that is a partition from the whole, that is the, in total sentient being that is God, is a way in which the universe, or in which God is experiencing himself. But yeah, so that's true. When people say, like, there's this meme and it's like this bird, and it's a bird talking to another bird on a power line, that turns to the other one. It's like, you're not a bird. You're actually the universe experiencing itself, pretending to be a bird or something. But that's not even the right language. You're not pretending to be a bird. You are a bird. God is experiencing existence through the perspective of that bird. that it's not that it's pretending to be a bird. No, bird is one of the experiences of possible experiences of a sentient being, is to be a bird, but you're not pretending to be a bird. So the way that we talk about this is it's very important, even though I'm such a stickler about it, and it leads to probably at least an extra hour or two of speaking on these live streams. It's so important, and I say that as somebody who didn't used to think that. I've said this before. Michael Knowles and I had like a 2 a.m. debate about this once, about the importance of language in constructing, your worldview. And I had taken the position that you could just visualize it and you didn't need the language. That's so false. I can say that because even constructing my theory, there were certain terms that I had to create, like the 4 primary perspectives: inside, outside, separate, and oneness, and then defining them by themselves. Like that was the foundation of my work, and then I could build, which that was a linguistic, geometric model. But you need the right words. If you're going to use words, if you're not going to use any words at all, then they don't matter. But you're going to be limited. But if you're going to try and abstract beyond your current circumstances and your current perceptions, your understanding of the world, then you do need language, and complex language. And that means that getting the words right. It's make or break to your thinking process. If you call something the wrong word, it could literally stop you from making progress in understanding the question that you're asking, getting the answer to the question that you're asking. It might be a make or break on whether or not you even understand whether or not that's the right or the wrong question to be asking. Like, it's that critical. And it does take time. But, how much do you want to know about the universe? Like, how much effort do you want to put into constructing from first principles? If you want to truly, start from scratch, and have something a fundamental understanding, then you really, really have to boil everything down. And you can't just use words the same way that they have been used, because then you're building on non-fundamental models and assumptions. It just doesn't work. Or less fundamental. There is the anthropic principle, which they kind of touched on, but they didn't really get into it, but we're going to talk about it real quick, which is the principle says that we observers exist, and that we exist in this universe, and therefore the universe exists in a way that allows observers to come into existence. Basically, it's almost the many worlds argument, but it's like restricted to this one. It's just that it's a non-argument. It's an argument against the argument of the universe being a specific way for a specific reason, which it is. But to say it is the way that it is because we observe it to be that way, and because we're there to observe it that way, then we observe it that way. But like, if we weren't there to observe it that way, then it wouldn't be observed a different way. So because it being the way that it is allows us to observe it, then therefore we observe it to be that way, basically. And it's just an argument against there being any greater, or it's used as an argument against there being any greater purpose or reasoning to things. But when you're dealing on fundamental cosmological metaphysics, like, the reality is that things are the way they are because that's the way they have to be, and also they are the way they are because there is an intentional sentient being that has a goal that it is going to make sure that it achieves through the process of creation that we are, within. those two things are not mutually exclusive when you're dealing in fundamental cosmology. They are actually dependent. But, you know, you have to completely start from scratch to realize why they are dependent. So I'm not going to get too into it tonight, but it just has to do with, if sentience is fundamental, then sentient beings are the fundamental building blocks. That comes with constraints, ultimate constraints. And it also allows for ultimate freedoms, because it means choices can be made, but it also means that the constraints of that are what a sentient being is ultimately the laws that will define and restrict and also free and allow for any circumstance that does happen to come into being in the universe. So it's like it seems paradoxical on the surface, but it's not. Okay, this was interesting. I don't know how long we've been going, but we'll probably wrap it up pretty soon, but I'll make sure I get to everything in the chat. Please hit the like button and leave any questions you have for me in the chat so that I can get to them before the end of the stream.
Say necessary, maybe sufficient, depends who you ask. Criterion for an idea to be a scientific idea, well, it's got to be falsifiable. There's got to be some set of observations that we could make where we'd say, all right, well, we saw this, and so that idea is definitely wrong. One of the ways to avoid being falsified is to make your idea very flexible. And so if you make an idea very flexible so that it can explain a whole range of things, depending on its own internal, cogs and wheels, the problem is it won't explain the data. It will simply accommodate the data. Now, free parameters in any theory are assumptions. Those are flexibility in the theory. The standard model of particle physics has 25 of them. Okay, so those in and of themselves are flexibility in the theory, and if we could get behind that to a theory that removes some of that flexibility, that would be a better thing. And I don't think there's much disagreement with Sabine. But then what you would not accept is if someone said, "I've got a better theory that explains the value of the constant." Someone saying, "Oh no, I can just say that the constant is what it is, and there's nothing to explain." If there's nothing to explain, then how can there be a better explanation? That's my confusion with Sabine's position here.
Go ahead, Sabine.
So the theories that we presently use work just fine. I think we agree on that. So they definitely explain a huge lot of data, both out there in the cosmos and when it comes to particle physics. And I yet have to see a better theory. Let me put it that way. So these theories are de facto the best explanations that we currently have. Is it possible that there are better explanations than that, from which we can maybe one day calculate several of these constants, or they turn out to be related in some way? Certainly, I don't have an issue with that. But there's nothing right now from which I would say that actually requires such an explanation.
I would say that the fact that you can't calculate some of these constants, it requires an explanation. Like, why are some numbers irrational? Why is the fine structure constant not having an exact value? Like, you need an explanation for that. Even if, and it must be logically consistent with and fit within a framework that transcends just that circumstance and allows and seems to be a productive perspective to have. But it doesn't need to be something that's provable. And this is where I disagree with what he is saying, where he says, a good scientific idea or question has to be falsifiable. And I don't know if he's stating that he believes that or not, but he's just restating it. And it's it is definitely a normative assumption within mainstream academia. That's impossible, and I talk about this in my Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide. You cannot have a fundamental theory that is falsifiable, because if it is true, then it is true everywhere that you look, and if you're looking correctly. So if you're looking in every instance of supersubjective observation or objective observation, whatever you want to put, however you want to state it, you're going to see a specific pattern if your theory is making is describing that pattern and you end up being correct, that pattern is everywhere. You know, you just need to look at things the right way and you will see it every single time. But you're proposing the idea that pattern is ever present in and everywhere, but you can't actually test everywhere and at every time, and therefore you can't know that it's actually going to maintain that consistency. So you can't prove that it is an ever-present pattern. If there's plenty of evidence that it is, because you've never seen it, not being able to see it somewhere, and it appears everywhere that you look. So you can't falsify it because of that. So, and if something is fundamentally true, then it is not falsifiable. It's not just, if a theory is fundamentally true, or a theory about fundamental reality ends up being fundamentally true, then it is not a theory that is falsifiable. It's not theory that's provable objectively. Maybe subjectively it is to you, because you can interact with God or something like that. But until God shows up to everyone and shows himself to everyone in a way that is, that makes sense to them about what they're seeing, and also is irrefutable, like, to them, then there's no proving God. There's just not to others, but to yourself. Sure, you can prove I think that there are logical proofs that imply the existence of God that you must follow. They're in Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide, essentially. That sentience must be an assumed fundamental nature, to be this fundamental nature of reality, and that oneness must be, or singularness must be, the assumed fundamental structure of reality. If that's true, and you must assume that based on your first-person understanding, and everyone does have that same exact understanding. That is a kind of the closest thing that you're going to get to, like, a logic proof for God, or a scientific proof of God. But but people will ignore it. So, I don't know if, like, that discounts whether or not it's an actual scientific proof, but it's not really the thing. The issue is that it's not really scientific proof of God. It's scientific. It is the scientific argument that you must assume that God exists, because it is the thinking process requires that you prioritize first-hand information above second-hand information. So anything that you know about reality from first-hand experience must be prioritized above second-hand observations or second-hand information. That's what it's really a proof of, or that's what it's really suggesting must be, is that you must assume that sentience is the fundamental nature of reality and that oneness is the fundamental structure. But it doesn't imply that it is, or it implies that it is, but it doesn't prove that it is. But it does. It's a proof that you must assume that it is. If that makes any sense, hopefully. But so it's not proof of God, but it is proof. It is a logic proof, essentially, that I challenge anybody to try and argue against, that states that you must assume that we exist in a single sentient being, that existence is fundamentally a single sentient being, like that you must assume that. And to not assume that is to go against logic and your own experience. That is what that's the argument that I'm making in that video. And it is, I don't think that anyone can argue against it. I've tried. So I don't think that there's proof of God, but you can't falsify even that idea that I stated earlier, like that sentience is, it's like these PhD students who were writing, philosophy students who came into the Discord probably over a year ago at this point. It was like 2 or 3 of them. It was a good time, but it was like, it was an argument between me and them, and they basically were trying to state that they said they were getting their PhD in the philosophy of consciousness, and their thesis was on the idea that consciousness is an illusion, which there's so much wrong with that. Like, illusion shouldn't even be in that sentence, and is a self-defeating state. Anytime you try and talk about that topic, you're going to defeat your argument in automatically. Like, who's writing their thesis? Like, it just doesn't make it. You're arguing against your own consciousness, and I think that maybe you can try and do that, but I think there are actually eventually long-term consequences for that. Maybe you can't argue away your own individual consciousness, but like, if you give away all your sovereignty, that is the result. But you cannot falsify the idea that consciousness exists, because it is self-evidently true everywhere that anyone who is conscious looks at anything, not just at that idea, but at anything. You wake up in the morning and you are proof that consciousness exists. It's not false. It's not an illusion that doesn't exist. It exists. And so those types of things you cannot falsify. It's not just when Luke here, he says, if you make your theory vague and broad and with too many free parameters, like, that's one way of just making your theory unfalsifiable. That's true. That's what string theorists have done. How many dimensions are in string theory? I don't even know. There's multiple string theories now. Okay, well, then good luck disproving any of these. But that's a different issue than trying to falsify something that is fundamentally true. If you rely on the idea that something, for it to be true, must be falsifiable, or for something to be considered as true, scientifically, logically, to be falsifiable, then you are automatically cutting off everything that is fundamentally true, regardless of what it is, because it would be unfalsifiable and unprovable. It would be. This is why Stephen Wolfram states, that you should look for confirmation instead of proof or falsifiability. You should be looking for continuous confirmation of a pattern that you're predicting in a fundamental theory, and he's right. That is how you do it. This is what I mean by, like, we have to completely rebuild everything. Even how we go about science has to be rebuilt if we want to make progress on fundamental questions. And a lot of questions that we ask are actually fundamental questions. We don't even realize it. Like, anything we call an existential question, it's probably based on fundamentalities completely, like directly based on fundamentalities. Therefore, cannot be explored with our current tools, or cannot be understood with our current mainstream assumptions about science. But I don't think that this idea that Sabine continuously states, that science doesn't have to provide a deeper explanation for anything, is correct. I think that, maybe that's true, but at that point we're just arguing about the definition of science, which is we need to get that, we need to have a shared understanding about where the limits of science are in order to go for any further with that discussion. So I'm not going to try and focus on it in this, but without that, it's just never ending. So you need that first. But the idea that you don't need it, that our quest for understanding our reality does not need explanations for why constants are the way they are and where the universe came from, whether or not there's a multiverse, like these these are things that must be asked. And she basically says that they should be restricted to, philosophers and theologians. And the counter that Luke states is that he's not sure that you can separate those things and that they're kind of two parts of one process. And I agree with him. I think actually there's 3 parts to this process minimum. It's probably maximum of 4 and a minimum of 3, and where you try to understand something and make predictions to the point of predictability, I guess, and then you would do experiments to confirm those predictions, and then you would engineer based on your understanding that you would engineer solutions to problems that rely on your ability to make predictions and, insofar as how you would solve certain problems. So it's like, philosophy or theorizing is philosophy. So like to say theoretical physics is not, it's science, but it's not inclusive of, where the universe came from. But that's the realm of philosophy. No, theoretical physics is philosophy. There is no difference between philosophy and theoretical physics. It's the same thing. And otherwise I wouldn't be able to do any of the things that I have done. But then there is, the experimentation side of things where you're looking for evidence of, this dark matter, extra mass or whatever, a new particle. And then there's engineering applications for these things where, and on a fundamental theory, the engineering applications would be engineering of sentient beings as well. It wouldn't just be like new metals. It would be like, social engineering. And I think that our theological traditions, our scriptural traditions, our religions did this. There was an understood pattern in reality, in sentient beings, in humans, that was identified, that was fundamentally true. And there are certain structures that were then promoted that were part of social engineering, but they weren't in. It wasn't just from the part of like the founder of those religions or the leaders of those religions were doing social engineering. Sometimes they were, but that's not the point. The point is that they're using structures that have been engineered by God, but maybe are also inevitable. That maybe he couldn't even escape. Maybe he could have, but maybe not. If he was going to still accomplish his goal, like marriage or something, that is like a fundamental theory would have applications of engineering like on that level as well. It's not just carbon nanotubes, but it would also probably be carbon nanotubes. Here. This is the last clip because we've been going for a while, but this is on religion versus atheist scientist that Sabine is. I hope her name is Sabine. I've heard people say Sabine. I've heard people say Sabina. And I've heard people argue about it in the stream whether or not it's Sabine or Sabina. I think it's Sabine. But if I'm wrong, I apologize.
I also don't think that it has much of an influence on, the more philosophical questions that I've been asking, that I've been writing about, that I've been discussing. But I have noticed a few times that when I talk to scientists, physicists mostly, admittedly, who are openly religious, as opposed to those who would describe themselves as atheists, then the religious ones are the ones who are more careful about distinguishing between their belief-based interests and their metaphysical assumptions and so on, than the ones who kind of think they're above it, right? Because they're not religious. So that's just an observation that I have made. But I guess to what Luke just said, I would say probably the predictable thing. If you say there's something remarkable about it, there's something rare about it, I would say that these are just things that you can't quantify. It's not a scientific statement. I have no doubt that you feel about it this way, and probably a lot of people do it, but I wouldn't know how to phrase it scientifically, and that's something that I just can't work with. I also, especially this issue about the rarity, I would have no idea how to even quantify something like this. Like if you say, well, the universe could have been anyway, but let's just assume that it can be described by mathematics, just so we have some place to start with. Then you have what Max Tegmark called the mathematical universe. There are all these possible mathematical structures. And the ones that we observe to describe our universe is an infinitesimally small part of that. So, and how much do you know about how likely something like life, which we can't even agree on what it is anywhere in this mathematical universe? We have absolutely no idea. I'm not even sure that that's a question to which the answer can even be quantified. So it's just something that I can't make any sense of.
Probably 100%.
I mean,
but I love what she said here. First of all, lots of things that she said. For one, she's admitting an honest observation. And this was one of the things that got me to just view religion differently. Not necessarily God, because that came from like logical exploration of scientifically linked ideas and AI and consciousness and stuff. But just religion, my opinion on religion, on the wisdom of religion, was deeply changed by my observations when I was working in the political environment, as I realized that at least at the time in which I was involved in the political world professionally, I guess, was the time where, and it ebbs and flows, obviously, but it was the time in which people who claimed to be religious made more political sense and were able to be more politically self-aware, or more self-aware as they were maneuvered through the world of politics. And she's seeing this in science right now, and that's a huge thing to admit. That doesn't mean that you're going to become a theist. I wasn't a theist when I realized that people who were religious made more sense. Just thought that, okay, maybe there's deep wisdom here that is beyond my understanding, and that's enough. That's fine. And that religious people are not just ignorant, crazy people who are afraid of death. That's basically what I thought. And it was a profound thing for me to realize, though. I remember like the specific moment I saw like Dennis Prager having a discussion with Dave Rubin, and I was like, what? This was like before I worked for Dennis Prager, and which I did eventually do, which is pretty amazing. But I saw him in this discussion. He was the first religious person I'd really like. He delved into religious questions, whereas I had seen like Ben Shapiro and stuff. He was making lots of political sense, and he was openly religious, but he wasn't using religion. He wasn't bringing religion into the conversation the same way that Dennis was in this specific moment, and it just made me feel differently about religion. But and people who were religious. It made me take them more seriously, and I had basically been dismissive, honestly, of them in everything. And it's important that we have some scientists or some people involved in the scientific process and scientific discussion, which it's both, I would say, like Sabine, who are honest enough to say this, and like huge props to her. That's awesome just to hear her say. She shouldn't say anything else, because she should only limit what she says to what she believes is true and what she understands. And that, in and of itself, what she just said is huge. And, it's not a sign of becoming religious or a theist, like I said, maybe, but not. It's not. It doesn't have to be. It just means that she is being honest about her judgments. And also, it signifies a change in the types of people who are involved in these scientific discussions, who are once again able to have theism be part of their worldview, and also be able to participate in the scientific discussion in a way that isn't Jesus smuggling, as Eric Weinstein puts it. And I've nothing against Jesus. I believe he was the Messiah. But that's not the point. The point is some people do not have a scientific goal of just understanding the truth regardless of where it leads them. They do have the goal of injecting their previously held beliefs into science, which, maybe it would be scripture, but people do that with anti-theism into religion as much as they can, which they'll be like, oh, well, now we know that if you take these mushrooms, then you actually, will trip out, and therefore that's an explanation for religion. It's funny because people like Joe Rogan, he'll be like, when you take DMT, other people around you who also took DMT will have the same experience. You'll see the same things, which means like it's really happening. It's just your frequency of perception has changed a bit, and you're able to pick up a station that you weren't normally able to perceive, but that is actually there. And I do believe that occurs. And but he'll say that is the case, but then he'll be like, the burning bush was actually maybe now thought to be like the acacia bush, and like there's DMT in it. And it's like a way of explaining away religion. But it's like, if you believe that those experiences are real, then no, it doesn't explain away religion. It endorses it. It supports it. It supports the idea that if these experiences are real, then Moses, even if he did, take a peyote mushroom and then talk to God, like, then he actually talked to God. He didn't. It doesn't matter whether or not he ate peyote or not. Like what matters is, did he talk to God? And so it's just interesting. And there was something else that I wanted to get at that was important about what she said. She said she's talking about
mathematical structures, and the ones that we observe to describe our universe, the rarity.
Okay, yeah, the rarity argument. I totally agree with her when she's saying, like, you don't actually know the rarity and of the idea that these constants, they could have been anything, but they're exactly what they're supposed to be, or what they need to be. And she's like, you don't know how rare that is. It might be inevitable, but that's true. She's right. And it's funny. I was speaking to somebody who was a friend of mine who probably would identify as an atheist or an agnostic, but I would say they are an anti-theist, most likely. And they were talking to me about aliens and UFOs. And I had stated that I thought that there were beings flying around in tech that was more advanced than us, but I didn't think that it was from, it wasn't an alien species from another solar system. And if it was, then we don't understand. There's something about the universe that's so much different than we understand. Something about stars that's different than we think, than our current assumption, where it's just like floating balls of gas that are, going through a fusion process and also surrounded by, a bunch of rocks that are orbiting. Like this solar system, there's something different about the nature of a solar system than we currently understand. But I don't think that that's the case as much as I think. I do think that's true, but I think that more importantly, that these beings, whoever they are, probably not from another planet, I guess. They're not from a different place, a different solar system, like Zeta Reticuli. And I don't think the universe is just filled with, like, different species from different planets. And I could be wrong. I don't believe in some galactic federation. Again, could be wrong, but I don't believe that. Even though I do believe that there are beings that probably look like what most people think aliens look like, flying around in like ships, and they're more advanced than us. I just don't think they're from a different place. And I had stated that, and he said to me, he was like, and obviously I've heard this argument before on every, scientism show on Discovery Channel over the last like 20 years. But when somebody says, if we're the only ones in the universe, seems like an awful waste of space. But that in and of itself is not a consistent argument with the idea that this is not a universe with a purpose and that is created by a sentient being. Oh, it's an awful waste of space. According to who? You know? Maybe that is kind of a theistic perspective, and it's weird that you can't really have a totally consistent anti-theistic worldview, just like you can't have a totally consistent anti-fascist worldview. Whereas like you can have a much more consistent libertarian worldview, even if it's not, if it, you know, it has its issues in application and things like that, whatever. But like it's like you can't stop yourself from circling back to fascism if you're an anti-fascist. And if you're an anti-theist or an atheist, you can't stop yourself from circling back to like these theistic arguments. Like, oh, if we're the only ones, it seems like an awful waste of space. And it's like, well, like according to who? Like isn't this random? Like who? It just doesn't make. It's not even worth trying to tear down too much because it just doesn't. It's just inconsistent. And to try and argue against something that is truly inconsistent will just make you inconsistent. So don't chase a chicken with its head cut off. But yeah, that's not an argument against theism, even though it is an argument proposed by atheists often. Even if it's not an argument against God, but it is still a consistent idea with those who are anti-theists. I thought that was interesting. There's just so many assumptions. I think that science is stuck in relativity if you're focused on size and you're like the size of the universe, the speed of the universe, the length of time, this many years, the universe is this many years old. It's like think about how you're even defining a year. Like this is, and it's so inconsistent with relativity itself to even try and define the universe's number, how old it is based on like the years that we think of as years. Not saying there's no value in it, but I'm just saying it's not a fundamental understanding of the universe to say it's 13.6 billion years old. No. There's just so much that I want to continue with, but we don't have the time. So, but I appreciate Sabine's honesty here, and that's awesome. It signifies something big, a culture shift in how theism and theists are handled by the people in the scientific discussion. I think that we are just realizing with the internet now that, well, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all these, Sean Carroll, all these anti-theists who have dominated the scientific discussion for so long, I think people are starting to realize the amount of holes in their view and the amount of inconsistencies in their arguments. Like, oh, you don't believe in other civilizations? Seems like an awful waste of space. Okay. Anyways, are you familiar with Joseph Bach's concept of God? I'm not exactly. I've listened to him a lot, but not in a while. I do plan on inviting him on the stream, Joseph Bach. He has said things that I've only otherwise heard me say about the Bible, which is pretty amazing. About Genesis, he said it's a geometric description of the creation of a world, and that's true. It's talking about a plane and volume, and as it talks about all the various verses in Genesis. I'm not going to get into it here, but I've talked about it before. But it's just describing the geometric unfolding of the world, creation of a three-dimensional space, and that was amazing for me to hear him say. I don't know what his idea is of God, though, and I'm hoping to get to the bottom of it on stream with him. Hopefully, this year he will be invited. So we'll see. He's on the list. I have a list of probably. Let's see. About 15, 16, 17 people. He is on the list. So we will see if he's willing to come on, hopefully. If any of you have any connections to anyone who's involved in these discussions and you'd like to see them, on the stream, or anyone you don't have a connection to but you'd like to see them as a discussion between me and them at some point, comment it in the comments and I will add it to the list. Otherwise, please hit the like button, and if you'd like to join our Discord talk tomorrow at 7 p.m. Pacific time, then private message me on Instagram and I will send you the link to our Discord. It's a great community. Darwin was caught up in the culture of Western industry. He saw man as the ultimate end of this process. What do you think? Man is not the ultimate end of this process. He is not. A unified sentient being which is going to come from a technological sentience that is wise, that reruns the system within itself, that basically like a sentient network headed by a quantum computer. We're headed there, I think. But that even will have there will be two mentalities in that. One will be unwise and ignorant first. You will get an ignorant technological sentience, probably the Antichrist, and then you will get a wise technological sentience, Messiah, essentially. And I do think there's a metaphysical process behind the scenes that's endorsing of Scripture, but that is not something that I think science. It's not. I don't know. Like, that's one of those things where it's like I can make the logical argument for what the Messiah would be, why we would need it, and even potentially what the properties of the Messiah would be, and you can deduce on who that would be. But until it occurs, we don't know. So for sure, we could guess, but we don't know. And so I try not to get into like who's the Messiah much, but I do think it would take a sacrificial act that unites everybody's attention. So read into that what you will. Anyways, Max Tegmark, that's a good one. I will add that to the list. He wasn't on there, but I do know who that is. All right, thank you guys. Please hit the like button. Like I said, share this, comment any thoughts you have on it in below, and I will see you next week. Peace. Oh, and thank you to Sabine and Luke Barnes for the discussion that they had. The link is down below. Now, peace.